Good morning, everybody. You're tuned into today's PIR Live Event. I'm your host for today, Brent Peltola. Our guest today is Ryan Marciniak from Astronomy in Action and the Ontario Science Centre. Ryan is an educator, entertainer, and astronomer who is going to discuss some topics of astronomy in the solar system, ranging from black holes to the challenges of space travel. Welcome to PIR Live Event, Ryan.
Glad to be here, Brent.
Before we get started, I'd also like to welcome today's viewers watching the live stream. It's great to have you with us today. Remember that you can tweet your questions to us using hashtag AskPIR throughout this live event. If there's room in your tweet, include your name, school, city, so that we can give you a shout out. I look forward to getting to some questions in a few moments, but first I'll turn it over to Ryan to give us a little bit more of an introduction to his background and talk about space. Thanks so much for joining us today, Ryan.
Oh, my pleasure, Brent. We're going to have a lot of fun. I'm used to doing these kind of calls where I can see all of the people watching, but because there's so many of you, I can't actually look at you. But I'm going to give you a wave anyway, and I'm going to assume that everybody's waving back because that's always fun, right? So I am an astronomer. I've been studying space since I was a little kid. I was about 8 years old when I started doing space stuff, and I haven't stopped. I work at the Ontario Science Centre. I give the planetarium shows there. I help produce new planetarium shows. I travel all around the province doing cool science demos, blowing stuff up. It's a pretty good life. I enjoy it a lot. So we're going to have a lot of fun today, and I'm going to talk to you about some of the coolest things in space and questions that I always get. So if you have any great questions as we go along, feel free to tweet them to Brent, and I would love to answer them as we go. So I'm going to start off talking about black holes because I know everybody wants to know all about black holes. That's what everybody's excited about. The common questions I get are, can I go into a black hole and end up somewhere else in the universe? Can I travel through a wormhole and end up somewhere totally different? What happens if you go into a black hole? What happens if a black hole comes close to the Earth? All those crazy things. So we're going to go through all of that stuff. And the first thing I hate to tell you is that, sadly, we can't really travel through a black hole right now. We can't use it as a wormhole. We can't use it as a portal to another dimension or anything crazy like that. The thing about a black hole is that it's a lot of stuff packed into a really small space. Okay, so if you think about the tides on the Earth, the ocean. So if you've been to the ocean, you know that there's high tide and low tide twice a day. The reason we have high tide and low tide is because of the moon. Okay, so the Earth is about here, the moon's over here. The moon's going to pull on this side of Earth a little bit stronger than it's going to pull on the other side over here. Okay, so that actually creates a little bit of a difference in force, and all the water on the Earth gets pulled to one side, actually to both sides. And then the Earth turns, and the tides switch. Okay, so it's the same thing with a black hole, except with a black hole, it's got so much such stronger gravity that if you get close to it, let's say you went in feet first toward a black hole, eventually the gravity on your feet over here would be so much stronger than the gravity on your head over here that you would feel a difference in force, and it would literally pull you apart like a piece of spaghetti. We actually call that spaghettification. Kind of gross, right? So you don't really want to go into a black hole because what will happen is you'll end up falling into it atom by atom, one after the other, over a very long period of time. So those atoms might get transferred to another place in the universe through a wormhole, but you're not going to be yourself when you get to the other side. So not a really good thing to do. If a black hole came close to the sun, let's say, or actually close to our solar system, why not close to the Earth? Let's say we replace the moon with a black hole. Okay, even a small black hole. That tidal force would be so strong that all the water on the Earth would actually fly up into space towards the black hole. And even some of the mountains and other stuff, and you'd be able to jump a lot higher when you were directly underneath that black hole. So pretty crazy. Wouldn't be that good. And of course, if the black hole was closer to the Earth, like even closer than the moon, say maybe 100 meters or a couple kilometers off the surface, it would just keep pulling rock up from the Earth slowly but surely destroying it. And it would also heat up that rock until the point where it got so hot, it would be like having a second sun in the sky and would literally burn us all. Not a very fun thing to imagine. But yeah, that's why we don't really want to go to a black hole anytime soon. But here's the thing, though. When you look up in the sky, you might think, oh, how many black holes are there? Maybe, what, 10, 20, maybe 1,000, right? We know that there's one really big black hole at the center of our galaxy, at the center of the Milky Way. But in the rest of the galaxy, we can't see them. They don't do anything. They're just floating around in space. And because they don't give off any light, we just can't see them. So we think that in space, in the sky, when you look at the night sky, there are something like 100 million black holes up there in just our galaxy. 100 million black holes that we just can't see. But don't worry, one of them is not going to pass by us anytime soon and destroy the Earth. There's bigger things to worry about. The odds of that happening are really, really small because space is so gigantic, right? So gigantic. We don't really have to worry about it. You have a better chance of being hit by a meteorite coming from space and bam, hitting you and then killing you than you do of a black hole getting close to the Earth. Yeah. Disasters are fun, right? So don't worry about black holes, but they are a really cool place. And I'll just give you the quick run through of how they're formed. Usually you have a star that's really, really big, and a star is basically a big balance of pressure, kind of like a balloon, right? If you blow into the balloon, you put more pressure on the air, the balloon gets bigger. A star has energy, heat pushing out, and gravity pulling in. Well, when the star runs out of fuel, it has no more heat to push out. Gravity pulls it in, collapses it, gets denser and more pressurized, so much pressure until it eventually explodes as what we call a supernova. Right? And after that big explosion, it keeps shrinking because the gravity keeps pulling it in until eventually it gets so dense and so heavy, so much gravity that even light itself cannot escape. And if you took the sun and turned it into a black hole, it would only be about the size of the downtown Toronto core. Wouldn't be that big. And the sun is actually huge. In general, the sun is so big, the Earth could fit inside it 1,000,000 times. So pretty big. And then a black hole, if you took all that mass, turned it into a black hole, it would only be about 6 kilometers across. Pretty crazy. So that's black holes. The second big thing that everybody asks me about is life. Aliens. Aliens are fun. We have never found any of them. Yet. The only place that we know life can exist in the entire universe is on the Earth. It's the only place we find life. Mind you, we haven't been very far. The furthest a human being has ever been in space is the moon. And the furthest a robot has ever been in space is just at the edge of the solar system, the Voyager spacecraft. And we haven't found anything. But there's a few places in our own solar system where we might find life. So before we go over that, though, I just want to talk about how many stars there are and how many planets there actually are out there. About 20 years ago, we didn't know of any other planets than what we could see in the solar system. There were 9 planets in the solar system at the time. Pluto was still a planet. And that's all we knew of. There were no others. But in 1995, we started finding planets around other stars. The reason we started to find them was we built big enough telescopes to actually see them. We came up with new ways to actually find them. Our technology got better. It became good enough that we could actually start finding planets. And since then, we've found, about 3,000 planets, which is pretty good. I know it's not millions or billions, but if you give a thumbs up to the sky, I'm going to assume that everybody's doing this, give a thumbs up to the sky, the amount of sky that's blocked out by your thumbnail, that's where we found those 3,000 planets, in that tiny little bit of sky. So if you imagine there's 3,000 planets over here, and 3,000 planets over here, and 3,000 planets over here, and over here, and over here, there's a lot more planets out there. And so we figure that about half of all the stars in the entire universe should have at least one planet, which is amazing, because there's a lot of stars out there. And what if those stars have more than one planet? What if they have 5? we've actually found a planet, or excuse me, a star with 5 planets. What if they had 10? Pretty crazy to think about. What if they were like our solar system? Or maybe there's a solar system out there that has 20 or 30 planets. That would be a pretty crazy place. So there's a lot of places out there that we could find life, right? Half of all stars should have at least 1 planet, and there's a lot of stars up there. So lots of places we could look for life, but the problem is we can't really see these planets that well. Our technology needs to get a bit better. Our telescopes need to get a bit bigger. They need to get the mirrors need to get bigger. We need to find more techniques so we can figure out what those planets are made of, right? Because as far as we know, life needs water, right? It needs warmth, and it needs some kind of materials, organic materials, to get it started. So organic materials are anything with carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. Okay, so anything like that. So we find a lot of that on Earth, of course, because we are all made of those things: carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, a bunch of other things too. And we have a warm sun, and we have lots of water. Those are the 3 things that we need to survive. Well, there's probably that we need to find that elsewhere in the universe too. But here's the thing: we can find that in our own solar system. Naturally, if you go closer to the sun than the Earth, it gets too hot, and you don't really get liquid water. Water just boils and you get steam. And if you go too far away, like Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, if you go further, the water freezes and you get ice. Not really that helpful. But there are a few places in our own solar system where we might find liquid water and some heat. 2 of them you might have heard about already. One of those places is the moon of Jupiter, called Europa. Europa is a big ball of ice, pretty much. It's got a 40-kilometer thick crust of ice all around it. But the thing is, because Jupiter is such a big planet, it actually pulls on Europa the same way that the moon pulls on the Earth and makes the tides. Except because Jupiter's so much bigger, it pulls on Europa and bends it and shifts it and causes it to wobble and bend and twist and rebound like an elastic. Well, that actually heats it up, just like if you were rubbing your hands together to warm up your hands. Okay, so Europa is actually quite warm in the middle, and we're pretty sure that underneath 40 kilometers of ice on the surface, there is a liquid water ocean within Europa that has more water than all of the water on the Earth. Pretty amazing. So if we find that water, we know there's a source of heat, Jupiter bending it and twisting it. All we need is some organic material, that carbon, nitrogen, carbon, oxygen, hydrogen stuff, and maybe there's life there. Recently, on the Earth, some scientists went to Antarctica, where the ice is about 1 kilometer thick. And after a few years, they were able to drill down into the ice, down to this little lake of water called Lake Vostok. Now, this lake has been isolated under this ice. Hasn't been touched for millions of years. Millions of years it has not seen the outside world. And so we thought, well, if we drill down there, what will we find? Will there be nothing? Will it be a place where there is no life? We thought it was a lot like Europa. So we drilled down into Lake Vostok, and they actually found fish. These tiny little fish, about this long, that had been under that ice for millions of years, isolated from the rest of the world. There was no sunlight to get down there. They were thriving off the heat from the Earth. All right, the Earth's crust was giving enough warmth that they could survive. And there was water and there was organic material. So as far as we know, life can survive in pretty crazy places. So maybe if we send a drill to Europa to drill down through that 40 kilometers of ice, which is a lot of ice, if we could drill down through there, we might be able to find some real life. Maybe there's fish swimming in the oceans of Europa right now that we just don't know about. Maybe they look like fish, maybe they look totally different. Maybe there's even a few tiny little bacteria, right? But the amazing thing is, let's say we go to Europa and we do find life. If we find life in 2 places in our own solar system, on Earth and on Europa, it means that life can form very easily. It means that life should be everywhere. If it randomly formed twice around one star, it means that every single star has the potential to build life. And life should be everywhere. That would be an amazing find. But of course, we haven't found anything yet. And it's not easy to drill through 40 kilometers of ice on another world, billions of kilometers away, when it takes a few years to drill down through 1 kilometer of ice on our own planet where we can actually visit. So lots of things to watch for. So that's life in the universe. I personally think that we're going to find something out there. I don't know when, I don't know how, and I don't know what it's going to look like. But just with the number of stars and the number of planets out there, I really hope we find something. At least I hope we find it in my lifetime. And the last big question I get is about astronauts going into space. I know we got a few more minutes. I'll talk for a little bit more. Brent, are we getting some questions yet?
No, we don't have any questions, so I'll encourage everybody to try and get a few in. We do have a couple of questions stockpiled that we can get to when you're done talking.
Okay, sounds good. Then I'm going to talk about astronauts going into space because I'm sure a whole bunch of you out there want to be astronauts someday. I definitely did when I was a kid, but it's not very easy. But that's all right. If you work hard enough, you can do it. I've met about 4 or 5 different astronauts and spoken to them a little bit and talked about their adventures in space and what it feels like. And the biggest thing they said was that space is very surprising. I mean, you as an astronaut, they train for years of just training to prepare to go into space. So they know what to expect. But when they became an astronaut, they were very surprised when they actually got into it. And the reason is that in space, we don't feel gravity. There is gravity in space, but we don't feel it. And here's why. If you imagine throwing a ball, let's pretend that I'm going to throw you a ball. Can you catch it? There we go. Good. Great catch. Okay, throw it back to me. Oh, I caught it. Okay. When you throw a ball on the Earth, it goes up and comes down and hits the Earth. That ball is actually orbiting the Earth. The problem is the Earth gets in the way, and so it can't keep going. But if you could throw that ball really, really high up, really far, and really fast, it would actually keep missing the Earth. It would keep falling towards the Earth, but it keeps missing it. And it goes around and around and around. That's what an orbit is. The astronauts up at the International Space Station, they're falling constantly, falling towards the Earth at a few thousand kilometers per hour, right? Really fast. A few kilometers per second even, really quick. And so they're falling towards the Earth constantly, so they don't feel gravity. They feel weightless, and so they can float around in the capsule and everything. But when you have gravity on the Earth, when we jump up, we fall back down. That's what gravity really is. And so we need the muscles in our body to keep us upright, right? Our back muscles keep us straight. Our neck muscles hold up our head, which is actually surprisingly heavy. I don't know if you've ever had to hold your head before, but it's pretty heavy. And so our muscles are constantly working to keep us upright. And every time I say that, everybody sits up straight. I bet you're all sitting up extra straight right now. You too, Brent. So if we didn't have gravity, like the astronauts in space do, we don't need to use our muscles. We don't need our bones to be strong. So what happens after a very short time in space, astronauts start to lose muscle. Their muscles break down and disappear, and their bones get very brittle and weak. It's actually very easy for an astronaut to break a bone in space. So I don't know if anybody has seen the video of when Chris Hadfield came back to Earth. Chris Hadfield is that famous Canadian astronaut. If you don't know, he was up at the International Space Station for 6 months, and he was actually the commander of the International Space Station for a while. So he spent 6 months up in space, and he had to exercise 3 to 4 hours every single day just to try and keep his muscles strong because he's not using them. When you walk around all day, you're actually using all your muscles constantly. That's why you get really tired at the end of the day and sleep for 8 hours a night. Because astronauts don't use their muscles that much, they have to exercise 3 to 4 hours a day, and they only need to sleep a couple of hours a night. They just don't get tired. They're not using their muscles. And it's also very hard to exercise in space because you don't have big dumbbells or weights. They don't weigh anything. You could lift a 500-pound weight with your pinky finger if you wanted to, just like that. No problem, right? So astronauts, when they're training in space, they use elastic bands. They try and pull them apart and they snap back together. So they have resistance training. And so Chris Hadfield, when he finally came back from the International Space Station, after 6 months in space, his bones were so weak and his muscles were so weak, even after all that exercise, that he couldn't walk. It took him 2 weeks to learn how to walk again. When he came back to the Earth, it felt like somebody had placed a big weight on his chest, pushing down on him constantly. He was feeling gravity for the first time in 6 months. So pretty crazy. And I want to ask you, and I know you can't answer me, but I want you to see if you can guess how long an astronaut has been in space for. What is the longest amount of time that a human being has been in space for? Is it 6 months? Is it a year? Is it 2 years? Is it 3 years? Just think about that. See if you can get a good guess as to what that is. The answer is a year and a half, 18 months. That's the longest amount of time that an astronaut has been in space. And he exercised a lot, and he came back and got strong again, and he was fine. He survived. But much longer than that, your body breaks down so much, it's really hard to come back from that. So let's talk about Mars, right? We want to send human beings to Mars. Well, Mars is a lot further away than the moon. On a rocket ship, it only takes 3 days to get to the moon, which sounds like a lot, but that's not bad considering. So 3 days to the moon on a spaceship. On that same spaceship, it takes 9 months to get to Mars. So let's think about that for a second. 9 months to get from the Earth to Mars, and 9 months back, that's 18 months. That's a year and a half. So even if we send astronauts to Mars, they stay there for 1 day, and then they come back 9 months, they've been in space for 18 months, the same amount of time that a human has been in space ever. So it's really, really hard to do. And if we're going to send astronauts to Mars, there's 2 things that we have to do. We either have to send them a lot faster, or we have to find a way to simulate gravity. And the best way we think we can do it to simulate gravity is if we have a spaceship that spins at the right speed. It's like when you're going in a car, when you're driving a car and you go around a curve. As you go around the curve, you feel yourself pulled the opposite direction. That's called centripetal force. And so if we have a spacecraft and you spin it, all the astronauts will feel like they're being pulled to the edges of the spacecraft. And if you spin it at the right speed, you can exactly simulate the amount of gravity on the Earth. Right? That's very expensive and very hard to do, but it is possible. So that might be one way to do it. The other way is just to send astronauts into space faster, get them to Mars faster. And that's possible too. So we'll see what happens. We hope that astronauts will get to go to Mars in about 20 or 30 years. So some of you sitting in the classroom right now may have the opportunity to be the first person on Mars, or at least the first set of astronauts on Mars. But definitely by the time you're the same age as your parents or grandparents, you should be able to fly into space for not too much money. We'll see what happens. And I'll give it over.
All right. We had a little bit of a breakup on the audio there at the end, but thank you very much, Ryan. So I was really interested in connecting a couple of the comments. So thinking about the potential of drilling through that 40 kilometers of ice on Europa and the time to be able to get somewhere. And I guess the other part of that is, even if you could get an astronaut there in adequate time, simulate gravity and whatever else, the 2 other pieces of issue that I see is, how do you get the drill there? And how do you ensure that you have adequate fuel supplies to run the drill and get back? So are those things that there's investigation on as well at this point?
Definitely. NASA does long-term budget analyses, because most of these missions to the outer planets like Jupiter take 20 years, 10 years to plan them, a few years to build and prepare them, and then a few years to actually let them travel to that other world. So with something like Jupiter and Europa, to send a drill there and the amount of fuel, they said it would cost something like $3 or $4 billion, which is money that they just don't have. So there's been a lot of ideas about sending missions to see if it's worth it. So the next mission that they're going to send is in, I think, the year 2022. It's called the Europa Clipper. So what it's going to do, it's going to be a fairly small mission. It costs a few $100 million, which is still a lot of money, but doesn't sound like it compared to $5 billion. But it's going to go to Europa, and it's going to get really, really close to the surface. So close that it can actually sample a little bit of the material, the atmosphere, the stuff that's been shooting out from the core of the world. Because the thing is when you have a heat source, it builds up a lot of pressure and everything wants to escape. And so we found places on Europa where a little bit of ice and water kind of spits out of the surface a little bit. So the idea is, let's send a little spacecraft really, really close to Europa so it can see what some of that stuff is, see what's in that water, and then send it back out again. And it keeps going around, does it again, does it again, does it again. So if we can find organic materials, if we can find the temperature of that water, if we can find what it's made of, what type of water it is, we can figure out if it's worth sending this huge drill and this huge technology to Europa to actually look for life. Right now, it's totally infeasible, right? I mean, to drill through a kilometer of ice is hard enough on Earth. Nonetheless, drilling through 40 times that much on another world. And the thing with Mars, too, you kind of touched on a point of fuel. If we're going to send astronauts to Mars, we have to give them enough fuel to get back as well. So one of the ideas is to have a refueling station above the surface of Mars. That's what we did with the moon, more or less. When we sent astronauts to the moon, there was a module that stayed in orbit around the moon. Okay? And then it detached, the lunar lander detached from that spacecraft, the Apollo spacecraft, landed, the astronauts did their thing, got back in, and then it launched back right to the Apollo spacecraft, which had enough fuel to take them home. So it's a lot easier when we're going down to the surface of a planet. If we can send something to orbit the planet, so if we send something to orbit Mars with a lot of fuel, detach a tiny little spacecraft to take the astronauts down and then back up, and then reconnect and take them home. So that's a really important part of going to Mars and anywhere else in the entire solar system or beyond. Great question.
Thanks. So one of the other things that we always try to do with these sessions is, get a little bit of insight from our guests around how they got to where they are in their careers. So you mentioned early on that you've been an astronomer since you were a kid. It's been a passion for you. But there's obviously some other education that you've gone through, some other preparation. So what is it that you've done in your life to get you to the place where you are today?
All right. Well, it was a long journey, but it was really fun too. When I was a little kid, I was 8 years old. I saw a solar eclipse when I was at school, which is amazing. That's when the moon gets in front of the sun and blocks out some of the sun's light. Problem was, it was a cloudy day, but we had some welder's goggles and could actually see the sun look like a crescent moon. It was really, really cool. And I got so excited by that, I actually asked my teacher if I could do a special project on it. How many kids actually ask their teachers if they can do an extra project, right? I was a little bit nerdy back then. I still am, but that's okay. That's a good way to be. So I did that extra project, and ever since then, all I wanted to do was read and learn about astronomy. I had a telescope when I was a kid. I looked at all the stars, all the constellations, as many planets as I could. I learned as much as I could. And when I went into high school, I knew that the only thing I wanted to do was space. So I went to university and did astronomy at McMaster. So I did 4 years of university to get a degree in physics with some astronomy as well. So there's a lot of physics in astronomy, so you have to learn all the crazy physics stuff in order to do the cool space stuff. And then I actually had a job right after I graduated from McMaster, where I got to travel around to high schools all across Ontario doing big science demos, like blowing stuff up and playing with liquid nitrogen and doing all kinds of fun stuff, working for McMaster University. So that was a really awesome job. And that, at that point, I realized that I really wanted to tell people about why space is so great, right? There's a lot of jobs for astronomers where you sit in an office and stare at a computer and do some math and do some, and real science is often done in a laboratory or at the eyepiece of a telescope or on a computer. You don't really get to interact with too many people for the most part. So for me, I decided that, oh, did we lose video? Oh, no. So for me, I decided that I really, really wanted to go and talk to people. So I went back to university anyway, and I said, okay, I'm going to get a master's degree because it'll give me a bit more credibility. It'll let me do some real research. And I really got to experience what it was like to be a true astronomer. I got to sit at the desk and look at something that nobody's ever looked at before. I actually studied the galaxy called Andromeda, Messier number 31, up in the sky. It's the closest large galaxy to us. And I got to discover something brand new about it. And I got to publish a paper, a research paper, on something that nobody has ever touched before, on where all the biggest, brightest star-forming regions are in the Andromeda galaxy. So it was just a tiny piece of the puzzle about why the universe is so awesome, but I got to put my name on it, and that was really cool. And then I came out, and I still decided I have to talk to people about space. So I started up a business doing planetarium shows with a giant inflatable planetarium that I take all over Ontario to different schools and camps and scouts and guides and youth groups and everything. I go and talk to everybody about space if I get the chance. And then I also got a job at the Science Center a few years ago, and I've been there ever since. And I love every single minute of it. I love talking to people about space. I love being a scientist and being able to talk about science. And I love doing this kind of thing too, talking to all of you. So it's really hard to figure out what you want to do, and you don't really know where you're going to end up. But if you have an idea, at least a broad stroke of what you're really interested in, it doesn't really matter where you end up. You're still going to be doing that big, awesome thing that you really enjoy.
That's fabulous. Thank you so much, Ryan. For anybody who has the opportunity to see one of Ryan's shows, they are a lot of fun. And you can find information about Ryan's work at Astronomy in Action if you do a web search on that. That's all the time we have for today, unfortunately. I'd like to thank all of our live stream viewers, and of course, thanks to Ryan for taking some time to present to us today and talk to us about your background. Thanks, Ryan.
Thanks a lot, Brent, and thanks everybody for tuning in. Give me another wave.
So this is going to be the last PIR event for a little while. We're taking a bit of a summer hiatus. We will be doing a couple of special events over the summer, so watch your inbox for more details. And thank you very much for joining us, and bye for now, everybody.